He shouldn't have followed the dog that night, but something in Rex's eyes made silence feel louder than orders ever could. It was 3:17 a.m. when Staff Sergeant Jason Carter stepped out into the cold air outside Fort Ridge, the kind of hour when even the wind seemed unsure whether it was allowed to speak. The base was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, not peaceful but suspended, as if the world had paused between breaths. Jason tightened his jacket against the chill, the fabric rough against his hands, and watched as his partner, a German Shepherd K9 named Rex, stood motionless near the edge of the gravel path. Rex wasn't behaving like himself. There was no alert bark, no routine scan of the perimeter, only a fixed stare toward the darkness beyond the floodlights, where the world dissolved into trees and shadow. Jason had worked with Rex long enough to understand patterns, and this was not one of them. Rex's posture was rigid but not aggressive, focused but not reactive, as if listening to something buried beneath sound itself. Jason stepped closer, his boots crunching softly against the ground, and lowered his voice. "What is it, boy?" he asked, though he knew better than to expect an answer in words. Rex shifted slightly, his ears angling forward. Then without warning he began to walk, slow and deliberate, away from the light. It wasn't a command, and yet Jason followed, because sometimes trust in the field wasn't about orders, but about instincts that had been forged in places neither of them talked about anymore. The night air carried the faint scent of rusted metal and damp earth as they moved beyond the secured perimeter, crossing into an area long marked off from active use. Jason recognized the direction almost immediately. There had been talk, quiet and unofficial, about an old industrial site half a mile beyond the base fence line, a place once used for supply storage before being abandoned after structural concerns and an incident no one liked to reference directly. The closer they got, the more the environment seemed to change, not in dramatic ways but in subtle shifts of sound and temperature, like the world was slowly holding its breath. Rex paused, briefly at the edge of a cracked service road, his head tilted slightly, as if confirming something only he could perceive, then continued forward. Jason hesitated for a moment, scanning the darkness ahead where the outline of a large structure began to emerge, its silhouette broken and uneven against the faint glow of distant security lights. The building was massive, its metal siding dulled by years of exposure, windows dark and hollow like empty eyes watching nothing. This was the abandoned factory. Jason felt a familiar tension settle in his shoulders, the kind that came not from fear, but from awareness, from knowing that places like this rarely held anything simple or straightforward. Rex stopped again, this time directly in front of a partially open loading bay door, the metal hanging slightly askew as if it had been forced open long ago and never properly secured again. A faint draft moved through the opening, carrying with it the smell of oil and old machinery. Rex didn't hesitate. He stepped inside. Jason exhaled slowly, checking his flashlight but not yet turning it on, allowing his eyes to adjust to the darkness as he followed. The interior swallowed sound differently, every step becoming softer, every breath more pronounced. Rows of rusted equipment loomed in the shadows, shapes indistinct but heavy with history. Jason moved carefully, his senses narrowing, not because there was danger he could see, but because there was uncertainty he could feel. Rex stayed a few feet ahead, occasionally pausing as if tracing an invisible path through the space. Jason noticed small details as they advanced, a set of old markings on the floor partially faded, a broken chain hanging from a support beam, the faint echo of distant movement that might have been nothing more than air shifting through hollow space. Still, Rex pressed on with unwavering certainty. Jason's mind flickered briefly to the past, to missions where Rex had reacted to things long before humans understood why, moments where instinct had outweighed logic and turned uncertainty into survival. But this felt different. This wasn't a response to threat. It felt like guidance towards something forgotten. As they reached the center of the factory floor, Rex came to a full stop. Jason stood behind him, the beam of his flashlight finally clicking on and cutting through the darkness in a narrow arc of pale light. What it revealed was not immediate danger, nor any clear answer, but something far more unsettling in its ambiguity. The space ahead had been altered, not destroyed but rearranged, as if someone had been here recently and left without completing whatever they had started. Jason lowered the light slightly, his heartbeat steady but alert, and in that moment he understood that whatever Rex had led him to was not random, and it was certainly not over. It was only the beginning. Rex didn't move, but his breathing changed subtly, deeper now, as if the air itself carried memory. Jason stepped a fraction closer, eyes scanning the edges of the room where shadows pooled thicker than they should have. And for the first time that night, he noticed something else, a faint metallic sound that did not belong to the building settling or the wind passing through broken panels, something rhythmic enough to suggest intention rather than accident. Rex turned his head slightly toward it, not afraid, not reactive, but certain. Jason felt an old sensation rise in his chest, not alarm, but recognition without context, the kind that comes when the past brushes too close to the present. He whispered under his breath, more to himself than to Rex. "You brought me here for a reason." The German shepherd finally looked back at him then, just for a second, amber eyes steady and unreadable, as if answering without words that reasons were already waiting inside the dark. Jason did not move at first. The sound had been subtle, almost too controlled to be accidental, like something carefully repeated in a space that had forgotten how to echo properly. The flashlight in his hand remained steady, its beam fixed on the center of the factory floor where Rex now stood perfectly still, ears locked forward, body angled slightly toward a corridor of shadow between two rows of rusted machinery. Jason adjusted his grip, feeling the weight of the moment settle deeper into his chest, not fear, but the familiar pressure of uncertainty that came before everything changed without permission. He took one careful step forward, then another, boots pressing softly against a layer of dust and old industrial residue that had collected over years of silence. The air inside the building felt heavier than outside, not physically but emotionally, as if the structure itself remembered more than it should. Rex moved again, slow and deliberate, guiding rather than pulling, leading Jason past broken conveyor lines and collapsed shelving units that looked like skeletons of forgotten work. Jason swept the flashlight across the space, catching fragments of detail that refused to form a clear picture, a set of faded safety markings on the wall, numbers stenciled in white paint that had nearly vanished, and a locked metal door slightly ajar, as if someone had tried to hide something in haste. Rex paused near that door, his head tilting slightly, and Jason felt a quiet shift in his perception, a recognition without clarity, like standing in a place you had seen before only in fragments of memory. He stepped closer, the beam of light tightening on the doorframe, revealing scratches along the edges and faint scuff marks on the floor that suggested recent movement. Jason exhaled slowly, listening, but there was no immediate sound now, only the distant hum of wind slipping through broken panels high above. Rex did not bark or growl. He simply waited, as if the next action belonged entirely to Jason. That alone made Jason more cautious than any warning could have. He reached out with his free hand and touched the metal door lightly, feeling its cold surface under his fingertips, then pushed it open just enough to peer inside. The room beyond was smaller than expected, a maintenance space lined with old storage cabinets and a single workbench covered in dust that had been disturbed recently. Jason swept the flashlight across the interior and noticed something that did not belong to abandonment, a neatly arranged set of objects placed in a way that suggested intention rather than decay. Nothing was random. Everything had been positioned carefully, almost methodically, as if someone had prepared this space for discovery. Rex stepped forward and stopped again, now directly beside Jason, his presence calm but insistent. Jason lowered the flashlight slightly, focusing on the workbench where a small collection of items rested beneath a thin sheet of plastic. There were documents, worn and partially folded, and a sealed container that looked out of place in such a forgotten environment. Jason hesitated, his instincts pulling him between caution and curiosity. He had been trained to recognize when something was wrong. But this was different. This was not wrong in the immediate sense. It was wrong in the way it suggested history had been interrupted. He glanced at Rex briefly, searching for any sign of tension, but the dog remained steady, eyes fixed on the same point, as if confirming that Jason was finally seeing what he had been led to find. Jason reached forward slowly and lifted the edge of the plastic covering. revealing more of the arrangement beneath. The documents were aged but preserved, stamped with markings that triggered something faint in Jason's memory, references to logistics, transport routes, and operations that had never been fully explained to those who carried them out. He frowned slightly, his mind trying to connect fragments that refused to align cleanly. Rex let out a soft breath, almost inaudible, and Jason felt it more than heard it, a reminder that they were not alone in what this place represented, even if no one else was physically present. He scanned the room again, this time noticing a second detail he had missed, a narrow corridor leading further into the structure, partially concealed behind a sliding panel that had been left open just enough to suggest recent passage. The realization settled slowly, not as panic, but as awareness that the factory was not abandoned in the way it appeared from the outside. Something had been maintained here, something had been waiting. Jason tightened his grip on the flashlight and took a cautious step toward the corridor, while Rex moved slightly ahead, positioning himself between Jason and the darkness as if assuming a role he had not been commanded to take. Jason paused for a brief moment, feeling the weight of everything he had seen so far, and then continued forward, because whatever Rex had brought him to was no longer a question of curiosity. It was a path that had already been chosen long before they arrived. Jason Carter felt the corridor before he fully saw it. The air changed first, becoming narrower, more contained, as if the building itself was guiding every sound into a single direction. Rex moved ahead without hesitation, his body low but steady, each step deliberate, as though he had walked this exact path before in a life that Jason could not remember sharing with him. The flashlight beam followed the dog's movement, cutting through the darkness in a controlled arc that revealed peeling paint, exposed pipes, and walls that carried the weight of long abandonment. Jason kept his breathing slow, measured, aware that sound carried differently in enclosed industrial spaces like this. The corridor extended farther than expected, bending slightly to the right before opening into a wider section where the ceiling dropped lower, forcing Jason to angle his shoulders as he walked. Rex stopped at the bend, his head turning slightly toward Jason as if confirming permission that did not need to be spoken. Jason nodded once, more out of instinct than instruction, and stepped forward beside him. What they entered was not a room of chaos or decay, but something closer to controlled silence. The space had been cleared recently, not in the sense of renovation, but in the sense that someone had deliberately removed signs of activity without erasing all traces. Jason swept the flashlight across the floor and noticed faint impressions in the dust, footprints that were not old enough to belong to abandonment, yet not fresh enough to suggest immediate presence. He crouched slightly, studying them without touching anything, then slowly raised the light toward a series of stacked crates along the far wall. They were industrial, standard issue, the kind used for transport and storage, but their arrangement was too precise to be accidental. Rex moved toward them and stopped, placing himself directly between Jason and the center crate, not blocking access, but marking significance. Jason exhaled quietly, feeling the weight of attention shift from exploration to recognition. He approached the crates and noticed labels partially scratched away, as if someone had intentionally obscured identification while still leaving fragments behind. Numbers and partial codes remained visible, hinting at logistics records that did not belong in a place like this. Jason felt a subtle tension in his chest, not fear, but something closer to memory trying to surface without permission. He had seen markings like these before. During a period of service he rarely revisited in conversation or thought. Rex let out a low, controlled breath, almost imperceptible, and Jason paused, realizing the dog was not reacting to the environment, but to something within it, something anchored in recognition rather than instinct. Jason reached out slowly and placed his hand on the nearest crate, feeling its cool surface beneath his palm. It was not locked, only sealed, as if whoever left it intended for it to be opened under specific conditions. He hesitated for a moment, then carefully lifted the lid just enough to peer inside. The interior contained organized materials wrapped in protective layers, not random supplies, but structured contents that suggested documentation, evidence, or preserved records. Jason's eyes scanned across them, absorbing details that refused to immediately form a complete picture, And in that moment, he felt Rex step closer, not urgently but intentionally, as if ensuring Jason understood that this was the reason they had come. The silence in the room deepened, pressing against them from all sides, and Jason slowly lowered the lid without closing it fully. He straightened, scanning the room again, but now everything looked different, not because the environment had changed, but because understanding had begun to reshape what he was seeing. This was not a forgotten space. It was a preserved one, and Rex, standing beside him with unwavering focus, was no longer simply leading him through darkness. He was guiding him towards something that had been waiting to be remembered. Jason Carter stood still for a moment longer than he intended, his hand hovering just above the edge of the open crate, as if the air itself had become heavier in that narrow corridor of the abandoned factory. Rex remained close, not restless, not anxious, but fully present in a way that suggested absolute certainty, as though every step taken so far had already been accounted for long before Jason ever arrived. The silence around them was no longer empty. It felt structured, deliberate, almost like a language without words that only Rex could fully read. Jason slowly withdrew his hand from the crate and turned his attention back toward the corridor ahead, where the darkness extended further into the building in a way that no flashlight could fully define. The beam of light in his hand revealed more industrial decay, but also something else, faint signs of recent passage that contradicted the idea of true abandonment. A thin layer of dust had been disturbed in a consistent pattern, not chaotic or random, but aligned with movement that had purpose. Jason felt a subtle tension rise in his thoughts, the kind that did not come from immediate danger, but from the realization that he was not the first to walk this path in a long time. Rex began to move again, slowly at first, then with a quiet confidence that pulled Jason forward without force. They followed the corridor as it narrowed slightly, passing along walls that carried old conduit lines and faded warning signs that had long since lost their meaning. Jason noticed that the temperature inside the structure had shifted again, becoming cooler and more stable, as if they were entering a section of the building that had been insulated from time itself. After several moments of careful movement, the corridor opened into a wider chamber that appeared to have once been a control area of some kind. The layout suggested oversight and coordination, with multiple empty stations arranged in a semicircle facing a central console that had been partially dismantled but not destroyed. Jason stepped into the room cautiously, sweeping his flashlight across the surfaces, revealing layers of dust interrupted by clean lines where objects had once been moved recently. Rex immediately moved toward the central console and stopped, placing himself directly in front of it, his gaze fixed on something that Jason could not yet see. Jason approached slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle deeper. And as he came closer, he noticed a small stack of folders placed neatly on the edge of the console, preserved carefully inside a sealed protective sleeve. He reached for them but paused for a brief second, glancing at Rex as if silently confirming what they both already understood. Rex did not move. Jason picked up the top folder and opened it carefully, revealing documents that were not technical in the usual sense, but operational records filled with structured data, timestamps, and references to movements and activities that suggested coordination beyond standard logistics. As Jason scanned the pages, fragments of recognition began to surface in his memory, not complete images, but impressions of environments, routes, and decisions that felt uncomfortably familiar. He flipped to another page and felt his breathing slow as he realized that the information was not random documentation, but a carefully preserved sequence of events tied to a specific period of service that he had not thought about in years. Rex shifted slightly beside him, a subtle movement that drew Jason's attention back to the room itself. And when Jason lifted his flashlight again, he noticed something he had missed earlier, a faint marking on the wall behind the console that had been partially concealed by dust and time. It was not a warning or an industrial label. It was a symbol, simple but deliberate, one that triggered an immediate but unclear response in his memory. Jason stepped closer, narrowing the beam of light, and realized that the symbol matched a designation he had once seen during a mission briefing that was never fully explained to the unit involved. He lowered the flashlight slightly, feeling the implications settle in without needing immediate interpretation. Rex remained steady, watching Jason knot the room, as if measuring his understanding rather than the environment. Jason closed the folder slowly and placed it back down, then looked across the control room. Again with a new perspective. This place was not forgotten. It had been intentionally left in a state between erasure and preservation, as if someone had wanted it to be found only by the right sequence of events. Jason exhaled quietly and spoke without expecting an answer from anyone other than the dog beside him. "You knew," he said softly, not as a question but as an acknowledgement. Rex did not react in any obvious way, but his posture shifted slightly, easing just enough to suggest that the path forward was still ahead of them. Jason turned his attention toward a second exit at the far side of the control room, where a narrow stairwell descended into a lower level of the structure, disappearing into deeper shadow. The air from below was different, still and unmoving, carrying the weight of something sealed away rather than abandoned. Jason tightened his grip on the flashlight and stepped forward once more, understanding now that whatever Rex had led him to was not limited to what they had already found, and that the factory was only revealing itself in layers, each one waiting for the next step to uncover what had never been meant to stay hidden. Jason Carter paused at the top of the stairwell, the beam of his flashlight cutting into a downward void that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. The air rising from below was colder, stiller, and carried a faint metallic dryness that made every breath feel slightly heavier than the last. Rex stood just ahead of him, perfectly aligned with the first step, his posture unchanged but his attention sharpened in a way Jason had come to recognize as absolute certainty. There was no hesitation in the dog, no sign of doubt, only a quiet insistence that what lay below was not optional, but necessary. Jason tightened his grip on the railing and began to descend carefully, each step echoing softly through the enclosed structure. The stairwell was narrow, constructed of old steel that had begun to show signs of age, but still held firm under their weight. As they moved downward, the temperature dropped further, and the sound of the upper levels faded until only the faint hum of distant air movement remained. Jason kept the flashlight angled slightly downward, watching each step as it came into view, but Rex was already several steps ahead, moving with the confidence of familiarity rather than exploration. At the base of the stairwell, the corridor opened into a lower maintenance level, more confined than anything they had seen above. The walls were closer together here, lined with old electrical panels and conduit boxes that had long since been deactivated. Dust covered nearly every surface. Yet even here Jason noticed the same subtle inconsistencies he had seen earlier, signs that the space had been disturbed more recently than its condition suggested. Rex stopped at the threshold of the lower corridor, his body angled slightly to the left, as if sensing direction rather than simply reacting to it. Jason stepped beside him and swept the flashlight across the hallway. The beam revealed a series of doors spaced at regular intervals, each one heavy, industrial, and marked with faded identification numbers that had become difficult to read over time. One of the doors near the end of the corridor stood slightly ajar, a narrow gap of darkness separating it from the frame, as if it had been left in a hurry or intentionally prepared for entry. Jason felt a subtle tightening in his chest, not from fear, but from the growing awareness that every layer of this structure was leading deeper into something deliberately concealed. He moved forward slowly, counting his steps without meaning to, while Rex remained just ahead, guiding without pulling. As they approached the partially open door, Jason noticed something new, a faint trace of scuffing along the floor leading directly into the room, consistent enough to suggest repeated passage rather than a single incident. He stopped just outside the doorway and listened. The silence inside was not empty. It was controlled, as if the room beyond had been sealed off from time itself. Jason raised the flashlight slightly and angled it through the opening, revealing the edge of a small storage area, lined with metal shelving units that were mostly empty but still held remnants of organized placement. Boxes were stacked in precise alignment, not abandoned randomly, but left with intention. Rex stepped forward and entered first without hesitation, circling once before stopping near the center of the room. Jason followed, the beam of light tracking across the interior until it settled on a single object placed on a low table. It was a compact case, secured and weathered, positioned carefully as though it had been meant for discovery rather than concealment. Jason approached it slowly, every movement deliberate, and knelt beside it. The case bore markings that were partially obscured, but still recognizable enough to trigger a deeper sense of familiarity that Jason could not immediately place. He hesitated before touching it, then carefully lifted the latch. The sound was soft but final, echoing slightly in the enclosed space. Inside were materials arranged with precision, documents, identification tags, and compact equipment that suggested operational use rather than storage. Jason's eyes scanned the contents, each detail adding weight to a realization that was forming gradually, not through shock, but through recognition. This was not random evidence. It was a preserved record of something that had been deliberately hidden yet carefully maintained. Rex stood beside him, watching Jason's reaction closely, as if measuring the exact moment understanding would fully take shape. Jason exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a brief second before opening them again to look at the contents once more. The lower level was no longer just a continuation of the factory. It was the foundation of something far more intentional, a place where memory and concealment had been layered together until only fragments remained visible. Jason closed the case gently but did not secure it, leaving it open as if acknowledging that what lay inside was not meant to be sealed away again. He stood slowly, the weight of the discovery settling into a quiet certainty that the path forward was no longer about searching. It was about confronting what had already been waiting in silence long before he ever followed Rex through the dark. Jason Carter remained standing in the lower chamber for several seconds without speaking, the weight of what he had just seen pressing against a silence that felt deeper than any sound the factory had offered so far. The flashlight in his hand lowered slightly, its beam resting on the open case beside him, illuminating documents and equipment arranged with an order that no longer felt like storage, but like intention preserved through time. Rex stood a few feet away, perfectly still, his attention not on the objects themselves, but on Jason, as if waiting for the moment understanding would fully settle. Jason slowly exhaled and looked away from the case, scanning the room again with a different awareness than before. Everything here, from the sealed environment to the careful placement of materials, suggested continuity rather than abandonment. This was not a forgotten site. It was a controlled silence that had been maintained for a reason. He took a slow step forward, then another, moving toward the far end of the chamber where a narrow maintenance door stood partially concealed behind a hanging panel. The air near that door felt slightly different, not colder or warmer, but stiller, as if sound itself had difficulty crossing the threshold. Jason approached carefully, his flashlight beam tightening as he reached for the handle. Before he touched it, Rex moved ahead of him, positioning himself directly in front of the door, not blocking it, but anchoring it, as if confirming what lay beyond was the final piece of a pattern only he fully recognized. Jason paused and looked down at the dog, noticing for the first time that Rex's focus was no longer exploratory. It was resolute. Jason placed his hand on the door and pushed it open slowly. The hinge released without resistance, revealing a narrow passage beyond, lined with older infrastructure that appeared even less maintained than the sections they had already explored. The walls here carried deeper wear, but also subtle indications of something that had once been actively maintained and then deliberately left to fade. Jason stepped through first, Rex following closely behind. The passage extended only a short distance before opening into a small, enclosed room that immediately felt different from everything else in the facility. There were no crates, no shelving, no scattered remnants of industrial use. Instead, the space contained a single table positioned at the center, illuminated faintly by a narrow shaft of light filtering through a cracked section of the ceiling above. Jason moved toward it slowly, each step measured, and as he came closer he saw that the table held a series of organized materials placed with careful precision. Unlike the rooms above, this arrangement did not feel like preservation alone. It felt like preparation. He lowered the flashlight slightly and examined the surface. There were documents, but also photographs, maps, and coded references that suggested a level of coordination that extended beyond simple record-keeping. Jason's brow tightened slightly as he scanned the edges of the table, noticing that everything had been arranged to be read in sequence, as if whoever placed it there intended a specific narrative to unfold in a controlled order. Rex circled once around the room, and then stopped near Jason's side, his presence steady and grounding in a space that otherwise felt suspended in time. Jason picked up one of the documents carefully and studied it under the flashlight. The information was structured in a way that suggested operational oversight, but also contained inconsistencies that did not align with official procedures he recognized from his service history. Names were present but partially redacted, locations were referenced indirectly, and timelines overlapped in ways that implied something had been altered after the fact. Jason lowered the paper slowly, his thoughts no longer fragmented but beginning to connect in a way that carried quiet weight. This was not just documentation. It was reconstruction, a version of events preserved outside official record. Rex let out a low, controlled breath, subtle enough that Jason almost mistook it for the movement of air through the room. Jason looked at him briefly and then back at the table, understanding now that the dog was not reacting to discovery in the present moment. He was responding to recognition tied to something deeper, something anchored in shared history that Jason had not yet fully recovered. Jason set the document down carefully and stepped back, allowing the full arrangement on the table to come into view at once. The structure of it all became clearer from that distance, not as isolated pieces, but as a single coordinated narrative that had been preserved with intent. He felt a quiet shift inside himself, not emotional overwhelm, but the beginning of clarity forming from long absence. The factory was no longer simply a place they had entered. It had become a point of convergence between memory and truth, and Rex, standing beside him in unwavering silence, remained the only guide through what was still waiting to be fully understood. Jason Carter stood in front of the table without moving for a long moment, the beam of his flashlight resting low as if even the light itself felt hesitant to fully reveal what had been placed there. The documents, photographs, and mapped references were no longer just objects of curiosity. They formed a structure of meaning that was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. Rex remained beside him, still and attentive, his gaze fixed not on the table but on Jason, as if measuring the exact moment when understanding would finally cross a threshold that could not be reversed. Jason slowly reached for another set of papers, this time noticing how carefully they had been layered, each sheet positioned in sequence, suggesting that whoever arranged them intended a specific order of discovery. He turned one page at a time, the sound faint but sharp in the enclosed room, and as he progressed, the fragments began to align in a way that no longer felt accidental. Locations referenced in coded form matched points he recognized from past operations, but not in the way they had been officially described. There were inconsistencies, gaps between recorded truth and structured memory, as if two versions of the same events had been preserved side by side, without ever fully merging. Jason's grip tightened slightly on the edge of the paper, not from alarm, but from recognition that carried weight without immediate explanation. Rex shifted subtly, stepping closer to the table, then stopping again as if confirming that Jason had reached the stage where interpretation could no longer be avoided. Jason placed the document back down and reached for a small photograph resting near the center of the arrangement. It was slightly faded, edges worn, but the image was still clear enough to trigger something deeper than thought. He studied it quietly, the flashlight angled just enough to bring out detail without overwhelming it. The photograph showed a group of service members standing in front of a structure that looked familiar in its industrial design, though the exact context remained unclear. Jason felt a slow tightening in his memory, not full recall, but the sense of proximity to something he had once understood completely and then set aside. He lowered the photograph and exhaled through his nose, steady but controlled, and for the first time since entering the factory, the silence around him felt different. It was no longer empty. It was expectant. Rex let out a low breath, subtle and measured, and Jason turned toward him briefly, realizing that the dog was not reacting to the documents themselves, but to Jason's shifting awareness. That realization changed the atmosphere of the room more than anything physical could have. Jason looked back at the table and slowly began connecting the sequence of materials as a single narrative rather than separate fragments. What had initially appeared as evidence or records now suggested something more deliberate, a reconstruction of events that had been carefully preserved outside of official channels. The structure implied intent, and intent implied purpose. Jason stepped back slightly, allowing the full arrangement to enter his field of view at once. The photographs, documents, and coded references no longer felt like scattered remnants, but like coordinated points in a timeline that had been intentionally shielded from easy understanding. He felt a quiet pressure building in his thoughts, not confusion, but the strain of recognition approaching the surface after long suppression. Rex remained steady beside him, unmoving now, as if he too understood that the next realization would not come from observation alone, but from acceptance. Jason lowered the flashlight a fraction, allowing the room to settle into natural darkness around the edges of the beam. In that reduced light, the table seemed even more defined, as though clarity increased when less was directly revealed. He reached for one final document at the edge of the arrangement, its position slightly separated from the others, and hesitated before touching it. The placement alone suggested significance. Jason slowly lifted it and read the first lines, his expression tightening slightly as fragments of memory aligned with what he was seeing. It was not complete understanding yet, but it was no longer speculation. It was connection forming between past and present in a way that could not be dismissed. Rex stepped closer, now standing directly beside Jason, and the presence of the dog in that moment felt less like companionship and more like confirmation. Jason lowered the document and looked across the room once more, realizing that what they had uncovered was not an ending point, but a transition into something far more complex than anything the surface of the factory had ever suggested. The silence around them remained intact, but it no longer felt like concealment. It felt like anticipation. Jason Carter held the document longer than he intended, his eyes no longer scanning words as separate pieces of information, but absorbing them as part of a structure that was slowly locking itself into place. The room around him felt quieter now, not because the silence had changed, but because his awareness of it had. Rex stood beside him without movement, his presence steady, his attention fixed not on the paper, but on Jason's reaction, as if the true signal being tracked was no longer external, but internal. Jason slowly lowered the document back onto the table, aligning it carefully with the others without realizing he was trying to preserve the same order that had been set before him. He stepped back one pace, then another, allowing his eyes to take in the full arrangement again, and this time something subtle shifted in the way he perceived it. It was no longer a collection of evidence or records. It was a narrative built in silence, one that had survived by being hidden in plain structure. Jason's breathing slowed as fragments of memory began to surface in a way that felt less like recall and more like pressure rising from something deep and long contained. He turned slightly toward Rex, noticing that the dog had not moved at all, but his focus had sharpened further, as if he was waiting for Jason to cross a final internal threshold. Jason looked back at the table and noticed something he had not seen before, a final layer beneath the visible documents. A thin folder placed almost imperceptibly under the edge of the arrangement, partially concealed but intentionally accessible. He reached for it slowly, pausing for a moment before lifting it free. Inside were pages that differed from the others. These were not structured reports or operational summaries. They were handwritten notes, fragmented and personal, written with a clarity that suggested urgency rather than procedure. Jason scanned the first page, and his expression shifted subtly as the language inside aligned with something he could not yet fully articulate. Names, locations, and sequences of events were referenced in a way that suggested first-hand experience rather than institutional reporting. The more he read, the more the boundaries between memory and documentation began to blur. Rex stepped forward one small pace, then stopped again, now standing directly beside Jason, close enough that his presence became part of the same stillness. Jason turned another page, and this time the connection became sharper, not fully formed, but undeniable in direction. The text referenced coordination failures, deviations from planned operations, and moments where decisions had been recorded differently, depending on who documented them. Jason lowered the pages slightly, his grip steady, but no longer neutral. Something inside him was aligning, not in conclusion, but in recognition of fragmentation that had existed for far longer than he had acknowledged. He looked across the room again, but the space no longer felt like a discovery site. It felt like a preserved intersection of history and intention, a place where truth had not been erased, but carefully separated into layers to prevent it from being understood all at once. Rex shifted his head slightly, a minimal movement that drew Jason's attention back without effort. Jason studied the dog for a long moment, realizing that Rex had not simply guided him here. He had responded to something embedded in Jason himself, something that had been dormant until proximity made it impossible to ignore. Jason placed the pages back onto the table, but this time he did not attempt to restore order. Instead, he left them slightly offset, acknowledging that completeness was no longer the goal. He stepped back fully now, allowing the entire arrangement to exist without interference, and in that stillness, the structure revealed its final implication. This was not just a record of events. It was a map of truth that had been deliberately divided, waiting for the right sequence of understanding to bring it together. Jason exhaled slowly, the weight of realization settling into something quieter but far more permanent than confusion. Rex remained beside him, unmoving, as if confirming that what had been uncovered was not the end of what they were meant to find, but only the moment where everything that followed would finally make sense in a way that could no longer be avoided. Jason Carter stood in the stillness of the lower chamber for what felt like several minutes, though time inside the abandoned factory no longer carried a clear structure. The documents lay scattered across the table in front of him, no longer forming a simple sequence of information, but instead existing as fragments of something far larger than he had initially understood. Rex remained at his side, unmoving, his presence steady and grounded, as if he had completed his role in bringing Jason here and was now waiting for Jason to complete his own. Jason slowly reached forward and gathered the papers together, not in perfect order, but in a way that acknowledged their connection rather than their separation. As he did, a subtle realization continued to build within him, not sudden, not explosive, but gradual and undeniable, like light returning to a place that had been sealed for too long. He turned slightly, scanning the room one final time, noticing how every element now felt intentional rather than accidental. The preserved structure of the space, the organized materials, the concealed compartments, all of it pointed toward a singular truth that had been carefully protected. Jason exhaled slowly and lowered the documents back onto the table, then looked at Rex. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. There was no command, no directive, only understanding forming in silence between them. Jason finally spoke in a low voice, not as a question but as acknowledgement, saying that this was never about finding something lost, but about confirming something that had already been known in fragments. Rex responded only by shifting his gaze slightly toward the corridor behind them, indicating without words that there was still more beyond what they had seen. Jason followed that indication, turning toward the direction they had originally come from, and for the first time the factory no longer felt like a maze of unknown spaces, but like a structured path that had been waiting for completion. They began to move together, retracing their steps through the narrow passage, the flashlight beam now steadier in Jason's hand as familiarity replaced uncertainty. The rooms they passed no longer carried the same weight of mystery, but instead felt like layers of confirmation reinforcing a larger truth. As they approached the upper levels again, Jason noticed how the atmosphere subtly shifted, the air becoming less compressed, the silence less dense, as if the structure itself was releasing them back into the surface world. Rex remained close, never rushing, never hesitating, guiding with quiet certainty. When they finally reached the main factory floor again, Jason paused and looked across the vast open space one last time. What had once felt like emptiness now carried meaning in every shadow and structure. He understood now that the factory had not been abandoned in the way he first believed. It had been preserved, not for use, but for revelation at the right moment. Jason turned toward Rex, and in that brief exchange of stillness, he recognized something that went beyond training or instinct. It was trust built through alignment of memory, presence, and truth. Rex met his gaze briefly, then looked toward the exit ahead, signaling the final direction without urgency. Jason followed. As they stepped out of the factory and into the night air, the contrast was immediate. The outside world felt open, distant, and real in a way that made the enclosed silence behind them seem almost like another time entirely. Jason stopped just beyond the threshold and looked back once more at the structure that had changed everything without ever raising its voice. Rex stood beside him, calm and steady, no longer leading, but remaining. Jason understood then that some truths were never meant to be revealed all at once. They were meant to be walked into, step by step, until the silence itself finally gave way to understanding.